I had to change up my plant setup because I realized that my cat could in fact reach my spider plant, and she was eating it when I was away at work.
Dixie! Dixie! Bad cat! Bad cat!
I finally didn't read a horror story. So, full disclosure, I watched the movie Fried Green Tomatoes a few years ago, so I was expecting the cannibalism. What I was not expecting, but should have given when and where the book takes place, is the intense and blatant racism. It was wild being at work, listening to my audiobook, living my best life, when I suddenly heard a white woman character, narrated by a white woman, written by a white woman, use a certain slur. I had to stop and pull out my earbuds to make sure none of my coworkers could hear what I was listening to. But again, book taking place in Alabama across the 1900s, the racism should have been expected. What I didn't expect was a fairly explicit and fun queer love story. Let's talk about Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistlestop Cafe.
Green eggs and ham.
So, the book follows two different storylines. There's Evelyn Couch, who befriends Ninny Threadgood, who lives at the same nursing home as Evelyn's mother-in-law, and their story takes place in the 1980s. Then there's Idgie Threadgood, Ninny's sister-in-law, and Ruth Jamerson, who run the Whistlestop Cafe, and their story takes place from the 1920s to the 1940s.
In the 1940s!
Evelyn's story is basically about finding self-fulfillment. When she meets Ninny, she's unhappy with her life, her marriage, her relationship with her children, and her weight, even though she's done everything the way people have said it should be done. But Ninny starts telling Evelyn the story of Idgie and Ruth, and that helps give her the self-confidence to stand up for herself and make changes to make herself happy. Evelyn comes up with this alter ego who is this strong, domineering person who can and will fix all the world's problems. And there's this whole rant in the book where Evelyn is imagining her alter ego going around fixing everything. And it's really satisfying to read, especially as someone who is fairly shy. I don't always speak my mind. So I so get where Evelyn is coming from, imagining her alter ego doing everything she can, and that giving her strength.
I'm a strong woman!
And Evelyn's story comes together when she's decided she's had enough with failing at diet culture, so she goes to California for a weight loss retreat, and she's able to make friends and discover that a lot of people have her problems and can understand and sympathize with her. And then Ninny dies, and it's so sad, both because Ninny's just a really fun character, and Evelyn has to leave her retreat early, and it's so sad that she was doing so well, only to get this to come and derail all of her plans.
We had a plan! We had a plan!
Then Ruth and Idgie's story starts when they're both teenagers, and Ruth comes to live with the Threadgoods between the time her father dies and when she's old enough to get married to someone who can support her and her mother. And while she's there, she and Idgie fall in love. And this is a book that was written in the 80s, so it couldn't be completely explicit, but it also didn't pull its punches. There's this one scene where Idgie and Ruth are laying in a little forest meadow, telling each other that they love each other, and Idgie begging Ruth not to leave. But Ruth has certain responsibilities, so she leaves and marries a man, and Idgie sits outside the chapel on Ruth's wedding day, blaring her car horn, and as it turns out, Ruth's husband is a nasty piece of work. But Ruth toughs it out until her mother dies. Then she calls Idgie and she comes with her brothers, and they take Ruth home to Whistlestop. And the story follows their life together over the next 20 years. And their whole story, even though the part of the book with Idgie and Ruth are written in third person, like the parts with Evelyn and Ninny, this is still the story Ninny is telling Evelyn, so we get to see the big events, like the cannibalism.
We eat people?
No, we don't eat people.
So this is where the racism between the book and movie differs. Because the KKK, to the best of my memory, were not a character in the movie, but they sure are in the book. There's this one scene where Idgie is sitting down and talking to the town sheriff, who's trying to explain why she can't feed black people out the back door of the Whistlestop, and how the KKK doesn't like it. But she says that she's not going to turn away customers. And it's black people, Big George and his adoptive mother, Sipsy, who are making the food. So why shouldn't they be allowed to eat it? And the sheriff can't really do anything about that until another branch of the KKK shows up to try and intimidate Iggy and Ruth. And as it turns out, Ruth's ex-husband is a member. Of course he is. And he sees her with her baby, and that leads to him coming back, trying to steal the baby, and Sipsy, who was watching the baby because Ruth and Itchy were off watching Itchy's parents die, Sipsy fights him off and ends up killing him. And everyone knows she won't get a fair trial, so they sink his truck and put his body in the best brisket that cafe's ever served.
It's called Greasy Joe's Bottomless Barbecue Pit. Oh.
And that's where the movie ends, but the book goes on. Again, it's 20 years following Ruth and Itchy through the good, the bad, and the ugly of their lives together. And not just their lives either. We see Buddy Jr., Ruth's baby, grow up. And he actually gets run over by a train, which is how Buddy Sr. died. And he loses his arm, which is just a brutal scene. Big George ends up being the one who scoops Buddy Jr. up and holds him in the car to the hospital. But because it's a segregated, whites-only hospital, he has to go sit on the sidewalk outside, covered in this little boy's blood. And these jerks come and start giving him a hard time. And again, I was at work trying so hard not to cry for Big George at that moment.
I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna cry.
But Big George lives a pretty nice life too. Because the book doesn't just follow Itchy and Ruth and their family, it also follows Big George and his life as he gets married and starts a family, and his sons and daughter as they grow up and go out to find their futures. And it talks about the Great Depression, and we follow some of the hobos as they drift into Whistlestop, and of course make friends with Itchy. One of them is Smokey Lonesome, and we get his whole life story. And there's Eva Bates, who is one of Itchy's friends and drinking buddies. And we learn about Sipsy and her story. And that actually made me so happy. So Sipsy was the daughter of a slave, and now she's not enslaved to the Threadgood family, but she works for them. And her job originally, before the Whistlestop Cafe, is to take care of the babies, because she loves babies, but she didn't have any of her own. Until a train comes to town with a baby whose parents don't want them. So someone tells Sipsy, and she runs across town to meet the train before it leaves and gets the baby, who is Big George. And that was just a fun little side story that, again, almost had me crying at work.
I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna cry.
And the book is just a lot of stories like that, about the cafe and the town and the people who live in it. And it's such a nice slice of life story following their lives for 20 years. And the reason it's 20 years is because Ruth dies. That part was really unexpected. She gets, I think it was uterine cancer in the 1940s, so there isn't much they can do for her. So when they run out of options, they send her home where she's left to suffer until she dies. And Sipsy just looks at Ruth and thinks, this isn't God's plan, and makes her overdose on her painkillers. Again, we see the good, the bad, and the ugly, and if you are not ready to cry, don't read this book.
Time's a charm.
I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna cry.
Now, I guess I should talk about the writer's takeaway from the story. Fried Green Tomatoes is a complicated book. It skips around in time, and it follows a lot of characters, but it does it masterfully, in a way that never feels confusing. And I think there's 3 reasons for that. The first is that the book is almost entirely written in third person. And when you write like that, you can use a character's name far more often without it seeming forced. The second thing is the weekly bulletins, which are the only parts of the book written in first person. They're little newspaper articles written by a woman, Dot Weebs, who lives in Whistlestop at the same time as Iggy and Ruth. Their parts of the book are almost always superseded by a weekly bulletin, which helps break up the story and tie it together, because the bulletins help to give us an overview of what's going on in the town and Iggy and Ruth at that point. And a lot of times they talk about something Ninny was just telling Evelyn about. Plus, they're just fun. It's charming getting Dot's opinion on stuff. And it helps keep the story feeling lighthearted and like a slice of life story, even through the most intense and soul-crushing events.
Ouch, ouch, ouch.
The last thing the book does to keep it from getting confusing is that it follows time linearly. We jump around between the two different stories that are taking place at different times, but we don't jump back and forth in time within the two stories. We don't read a chapter where Ruth and Iggy are in their 30s, then the next chapter we experience with them, they're teenagers. No, their story are linear, the same as Evelyn and Ninny's. This book is complicated, and it could so easily become confusing, but Fanny Flagg puts a lot of work into fleshing out the characters and setting and story that all helps the reader stay engaged and keeps the story from feeling confusing.
I'm confused.
Alright, I guess we should talk about the elephant in the room. Specifically this elephant, which has several smaller elephants inside it. We should also talk about the controversial subjects the book brings up, and how it handled the racism and queerness.
That raises red flags.
So, the movie sanitized the racism a lot, and to a degree I get that. Racism is an ugly beast, and not everyone will want to experience a story that makes you look directly at it like this book does. But you know what? I didn't care about Big George in the movie like I did in the book. The book is emotionally resonant in a way the movie isn't. It uses derogatory terms, slurs, and it has the freaking KKK in it. None of that was ever portrayed as good or okay, but it did feel real. I'm also aware those things mean that not everyone will be willing to read the book, and it definitely offended people. And that is a hard choice to make when you're writing something. How much do I want to show the ugliness?
Gosh, it's hideous!
And I feel like this is where Write What You Know comes in. I, as a white person who grew up in a primarily white community in the 2000s, should not just go and write a book like Fried Green Tomatoes. That's not to say I can't, but Fanny Flagg was born in Alabama in the 40s. This book is what she knows because she lived it. If I wanted to write something like this, I would need to put a lot of time and effort into properly educating myself on what life in the South during segregation looked like. And even then, it'd probably still come across as somewhat sanitized. And that's fine. I know plenty of other intense and horrifying things that would offend or upset other people. And it's my choice whether or not to include any of that icky stuff in my stories, or if it's more important to me that my book is consumable to a wider audience.
I always felt he deserved a wider audience.
And as for the queerness, I have to give Fried Green Tomatoes a round of applause, because for a book written in the 80s, it handled the gay love story beautifully. Obviously, it never explicitly said Iggy and Ruth are gay. We can barely get that today, 40 years later, but it got away with a lot. There can be a fine line between queer baiting and queer coding, and I feel like Fried Green Tomatoes did a wonderful job not even approaching the queer baiting line, while obviously queer coding its characters. And I don't even mind that it did technically fall into bury your gays trope. Ruth died, and it was tragic and felt like it shouldn't have happened. But in the same way, death in real life feels that way. She'd already gotten her happily ever after. Buddy Jr. was grown, and her character arc and potential in the story had been wrapped up. And it was beautiful, like this book. If you don't want to cry or see the ugliest parts of humanity, this is not the book for you. but it is fun, and it's a satisfying read. So go read Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistlestop Cafe.